A community in the crosshairs. The late afternoon sun bathed the streets of Riverton in golden light, casting long shadows over cracked sidewalks and weathered brick buildings. The neighborhood, a place of resilience and hardship, was alive with the usual hum of life. Street vendors calling out their specials, kids laughing as they played on narrow stoops, and the rhythmic beat of music escaping from passing cars. Angela Williams walked briskly down the street, her arms laden with boxes filled with supplies for the River Youth Center. The weight of the boxes was considerable, but Angela had carried far heavier burdens in her lifetime: responsibility, injustice, and the unrelenting duty to be a pillar of hope for the community. "Mrs. Williams," a familiar voice called from across the street. Angela turned and spotted Jamal Thompson, a lanky teenager with a broad grin and an infectious energy. He waved enthusiastically, his expression reflecting the deep respect he had for her. "Hey, Jamal," Angela called back, shifting the boxes in her arms to wave. She had known Jamal since he was a scrawny 9-year-old kid struggling with school and staying out of trouble. Now at 17, he was one of the youth center's most promising mentors, tutoring younger children and organizing community cleanups. He was living proof that guidance and care could change lives. As Angela stepped toward Patel's Grocery, a familiar storefront that had been a staple in the neighborhood for decades, she noticed a police officer standing at the corner, surveying the street with narrowed eyes. Officer Michael Reynolds. Angela had seen that look before, the wary, suspicious gaze that often settled on people like her, the unspoken assumption of guilt. Riverton had a strained history with law enforcement, and Reynolds was one of those officers who did little to ease that tension. Angela knew better than to engage unnecessarily, so she simply focused on her errand. The bell above the grocery store's door chimed as she stepped inside, the cool air inside providing a welcome relief from the summer heat. Mr. Patel, a kind-hearted man who had served the community for over 30 years, looked up from behind the counter and beamed. "Ah, Mrs. Williams. Always a pleasure," he greeted, his Indian accent a blend of his roots and decades spent in the South. Angela smiled. "Good to see you, Mr. Patel. I'm here to pick up the supplies for the youth center." Of course," he said, already moving to retrieve the pre-packed items. As Mr. Patel rang up her order, Angela glanced through the window and saw Reynolds still standing at the corner, his eyes scanning the street, lingering on every black or brown face just a little longer. Her stomach tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. "That'll be $73.50, Mr. Patel said, placing the last of the items in a bag. Angela retrieved her wallet and handed over her card. Once the transaction was complete, she tucked the receipt into her purse and lifted the heavy boxes again, pushing the door open with her hip. She barely had time to take 2 steps before she heard the voice. "Mom, hold it right there." Angela turned to see Officer Reynolds striding toward her, his expression sharp and authoritative. She could feel the weight of his scrutiny before he even spoke. "What's in the boxes?" he asked, his hand resting on his duty belt, just inches from his holstered gun. Angela shifted her grip on the boxes and took a slow breath. "These are supplies for the youth center's charity event tonight." Reynolds narrowed his eyes. "I'm going to need to see some identification and a receipt." Angela's heartbeat quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "Of course, officer. Let me just set these down." She moved carefully, placing the boxes on the sidewalk, and reached for her purse. But as soon as her hand moved, Reynolds' voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Keep your hands where I can see them." A ripple of unease passed through the pedestrians nearby. Some slowed their steps, others stopped entirely, watching the scene unfold. Angela froze, her hands hovering in the air. "Officer, I'm just reaching for my receipt, as you requested." "Slowly," Reynolds warned, his stance rigid with suspicion. Angela nodded, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for her purse. The weight of every pair of eyes on her shoulders made her skin prickle. And then, in an instant, everything shifted. Reynolds lunged forward, grabbing Angela's arm with brute force. The boxes tumbled to the ground, their contents spilling across the pavement. "What are you reaching for?" he barked, twisting her wrist. Angela gasped, the pain shooting up her arm. "Officer, please. I was only on the ground. Now," Reynolds shouted, shoving her forward. Angela stumbled, her knee scraping against the rough pavement as she was forced down. The heat of the concrete burned against her skin, but worse was the humiliation, the outrage that boiled beneath her calm exterior. The murmurs in the crowd turned to shouts. Phones appeared in people's hands, cameras recording every moment. "That's Mrs. Williams," someone yelled. "She ain't done nothing wrong." Jamal, who had been watching from across the street, felt his heart pound in his chest. His hands clenched into fists as he saw Angela, the woman who had dedicated her life to helping others, being treated like a criminal. He pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed a number he had memorized for emergencies. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice urgent. "It's Jamal from the youth center. There's a situation with Mrs. Williams and the police. I think you need to get down here. Now." Across town, in a sleek office at City Hall, Karen Brooks, assistant mayor and longtime friend of Angela, listened to Jamal's frantic voice. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Stay on the line, Jamal. I'm on my way." Back on the street, the chaos was only growing. Reynolds pressed his knee into Angela's back, fumbling for his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer and suspected theft." Angela closed her eyes, biting back the fury rising in her chest. She had done nothing wrong. She had complied. And yet, here she was, face down on the street she had spent her life trying to uplift. Jamal, fists clenched, stepped forward. "Officer, please," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "She runs the youth center. She's not a thief." Reynolds' gaze snapped up, locking onto Jamal with a look of irritation. "Stay back, kid." Jamal held his ground. "No, this is wrong." More voices joined in. More people stepped forward. And then, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Angela felt the shift in the atmosphere, the tension morphing into something else, an impending reckoning. The question was, would it be justice? Or just another cycle of injustice, repeating itself again? The weight of injustice. The air was thick with tension, charged with the static energy of something irreversibly wrong. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting the streets of Riverton in golden light, but for Angela Williams, there was no warmth, only the scalding heat of the pavement against her cheek and the bruising weight of Officer Reynolds' knee pressing into her back. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. The rough surface of the concrete scraped against her skin, and the pain from Reynolds' grip radiated up her arm. Around her, voices rose in protest, but she focused on keeping her composure. She had spent a lifetime being calm in the face of injustice, of speaking reason when others expected rage. But this was beyond anything she had ever faced. "Officer, please," she tried again, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is a mistake. I have a receipt." "I said, stay down." Reynolds barked, his grip tightening. Angela winced but refused to cry out. She would not give him that satisfaction. The crowd surrounding them had grown, their outrage palpable. People had pulled out their phones, recording every second. Some were shouting for Reynolds to stop. Others were calling for backup, but their voices barely registered in Angela's mind. Her world had narrowed to the weight crushing her down, and the certainty that, no matter what she said, Reynolds had already made up his mind. Then a voice broke through. "Let her go." "Jamal." Angela twisted her head as much as she could and saw the teenager standing at the edge of the growing circle of onlookers. His face was tight with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. He wasn't just a bystander. He was standing up, refusing to be silent. Reynolds barely spared him a glance. "Back up, kid," "This doesn't concern you." Jamal didn't move. "The hell it doesn't. That's Mrs. Williams. She didn't do anything wrong." More voices joined in. "She's a community leader. She runs the youth center." "Officer, let her go, man. We all saw it. She didn't do nothing." The pressure of Reynolds' knee lifted slightly as he looked up, suddenly realizing that the weight of an entire neighborhood was against him. But then his jaw tightened, and he pressed down again. "I said, back up," he shouted, his free hand moving toward his holster. The motion sent a shockwave through the crowd, a ripple of fear. Angela's heart lurched. She knew this was the moment where things could spiral out of control. "No," her voice, strong and commanding, cut through the noise. "No one move. No one give him an excuse." Jamal's chest heaved with barely contained anger, but he obeyed. He didn't step forward, but neither did he step back. The sirens were close now. Angela could hear them, could feel the tide turning. And then, like a sudden storm breaking over the horizon, the scene changed. The screech of police tires, the pounding of heavy boots on pavement, the arrival of people with authority, not just law enforcement, but city officials. The first face Angela saw was Detective Lisa Hernandez. The second was Assistant Mayor Karen Brooks. Karen Brooks was not a woman to be ignored. The moment she stepped out of her car, she took in the scene with the sharpness of someone who had spent years navigating the murky waters of politics, law enforcement, and community activism. Her normally composed face was a mask of restrained fury. Lisa Hernandez got there first. She strode forward, her badge gleaming on her belt, her dark eyes locked on Reynolds with barely concealed disdain. "What the hell is going on here?" Hernandez demanded, her voice slicing through the tension like a knife. Reynolds hesitated. Angela felt the shift instantly. Up until now, Reynolds had been in control. He had the power, the authority. But now, faced with other officers with more rank, more credibility, his grip faltered. She was resisting. Reynolds muttered, standing up at last, though his hand still hovered near his weapon. Angela pushed herself up slowly, wincing at the pain in her wrist. Hernandez's gaze flickered between Angela and Reynolds, then down at the spilled contents of the boxes, supplies for a youth event, not stolen goods. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I'm going to need you to step back, Officer Reynolds," Hernandez said, her voice dangerously even. Reynolds hesitated again. His eyes darted toward Karen Brooks, whose sharp, unyielding stare pinned him in place. He looked at the gathered crowd, their phones still recording. He knew. This wasn't going away. Angela let out a slow breath as she sat on the edge of the curb, rubbing her sore wrist. Karen crouched beside her. "Are you okay?" the assistant mayor asked, her voice softer than before. Angela nodded. "I'll be fine." Karen's jaw clenched. "This is unacceptable. I'm going to make some calls. This," she gestured at the scene around them, "is not going to be ignored." Angela believed her. Karen Brooks was many things, a politician, a leader, but most of all, she was someone who kept her promises. As the situation de-escalated, as Reynolds was pulled aside for questioning, as statements were taken and Angela was finally given back her dignity, she looked up and saw Jamal still standing there. He had not moved. She offered him a small smile, one filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said. Jamal swallowed, his eyes glistening. "You're the reason I believe in doing the right thing, Mrs. Williams. I couldn't just stand there." Angela nodded. There was so much more to come. There would be consequences. There would be battles. But for now, she knew one thing. She was not alone. And neither was her community. Angela remained seated on the curb, feeling the cool pavement beneath her palms as the weight of what had just happened settled on her shoulders. The bruises forming on her wrist and cheek would fade with time, but the memory of Officer Reynolds' knee in her back, the suffocating press of the moment, and the helplessness, it would stay with her far longer. The flashing lights of patrol cars painted the scene in hues of red and blue. More officers had arrived, and while some seemed disinterested, Detective Lisa Hernandez was in complete control. Her sharp eyes bore into Reynolds, assessing, calculating. Assistant Mayor Karen Brooks straightened from where she had been crouching beside Angela and turned to Hernandez. "Lisa, I want to know exactly what happened here." Hernandez nodded and turned to Reynolds, who stood stiffly, still gripping his belt. "Officer Reynolds, walk me through your justification for pinning a well-respected community leader to the ground in broad daylight." Reynolds squared his shoulders. She was resisting. Karen let out a harsh laugh, disbelief flickering across her face. Resisting what? Carrying groceries. Running a youth center. "I asked for identification." She hesitated. Reynolds said defensively. Angela, still seated, finally spoke, her voice quieter, but no less powerful. "I didn't hesitate. I followed your instructions. Slowly, as you ordered. And you still tackled me." Reynolds' jaw tightened. He looked around as if searching for someone to back him up, but the only thing meeting him was the expectant silence of his fellow officers and the burning judgment of the community. Hernandez crossed her arms. "You had no reason to escalate." She was reaching for a receipt, the one you demanded. Hernandez finished for him. Her voice was unimpressed. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to being questioned. Karen took a slow step forward, her voice dangerously quiet. "Officer Reynolds, you do realize who you just put your hands on." For the first time, something like true unease flickered across Reynolds' face. Angela met his gaze and saw it. The dawning realization. He hadn't known who she was. To him, she had just been another black woman carrying something he assumed she had no right to. A problem. A threat. Not the woman who had spent decades advocating for police reform. Not the woman who had worked alongside community leaders to build programs to keep kids off the streets. Not the wife of Riverton's mayor. But now he knew. And now it was too late. "Detective Hernandez," Karen said, her tone all business now. "I want a full report. I want this investigated at every level. There will be no covering this up. No sweeping it under the rug." Reynolds' face darkened. This is getting blown out of proportion. Hernandez shot him a warning glare. "No, it's getting the attention it deserves." At that moment, another officer approached Hernandez, speaking in a hushed tone. She nodded and turned back to Reynolds. "You need to turn in your badge and gun for now. You're being placed on administrative leave while we investigate." A murmur swept through the crowd. The people who had gathered to watch, to bear witness, exhaled collectively. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was a start. Reynolds' face turned red with anger, but there was nothing he could do. He unhooked his badge and handed over his weapon. His fingers twitched at his side, and for a moment, it seemed like he might argue. But under Hernandez's unwavering stare and Karen's icy gaze, he turned and walked away, stiff-backed, disappearing into the growing number of squad cars. Angela exhaled. She hadn't realized she had been holding her breath. A community that will not forget. Angela was helped to her feet by a young woman who had been recording the entire event. Her hands trembled slightly from the adrenaline still coursing through her, but her resolve remained unshaken. Jamal was still there, his face tense with residual anger. "They just let him walk away?" he asked, his voice edged with frustration. "For now," Karen said, "but this isn't over." Jamal swallowed hard and looked at Angela. "Are you okay, Mrs. Williams?" She smiled at him, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I will be." The crowd had begun to disperse, but not without parting words. "We got your back, Mrs. Williams," an older woman called from the sidewalk. "You've done too much for this community for us to be silent," another voice added. Angela nodded her thanks, pressing a hand to her chest, overwhelmed by the support. Karen turned to her. "I'll be issuing a public statement tonight, and I want you by my side." Angela hesitated. Karen, I'm tired. Karen's face softened. I know you are. But this fight isn't over. Angela took a slow breath. She had spent her life working to bridge the gap between her community and law enforcement, advocating for change, demanding justice, and still, today had happened. But this moment, this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every black woman who had been stopped for no reason, every innocent person forced to the ground under the weight of suspicion, every child who would grow up knowing that no matter how much good they did, the world might still see them as a threat. Angela squared her shoulders. She would not be silent. All right, she said, her voice steady. Let's make sure no one forgets what happened here today. Karen nodded, satisfied. Good. As they walked away, the weight of what had happened still clung to Angela like a second skin. But so did something else. Determination. Because if Officer Reynolds thought this was the end of the story, he was wrong. This was just the beginning. The storm that follows. The night after the altercation was restless. Angela Williams sat at her kitchen table, her wrist wrapped in a soft bandage, her cheek still tender from where it had scraped the pavement. The kitchen light above cast a warm glow over the space, but it did little to ease the storm swirling inside her. Her husband, Mayor Daniel Williams, stood across from her, his hands pressed against the wooden surface of the table, his face a mixture of worry and restrained fury. I should have been there, he said, his voice tight. Angela reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. No one could have predicted this, Daniel. No, but we should have seen it coming. He shook his head, his jaw clenching. Reynolds is exactly the kind of officer I've been warning the department about. He shouldn't even be on the force. Angela sighed, exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders. But he is, and I was the one on the ground today, not you. Daniel exhaled sharply and ran a hand over his closely cropped hair. You shouldn't have to be strong through this, Angie. You shouldn't have to be calm or measured. You should be allowed to be angry. Angela studied him for a long moment. She wanted to scream, to cry, to give in to the overwhelming weight of it all. But she had spent a lifetime learning that black women did not get the luxury of breaking down, not in public, and certainly not when the world was watching. And now, the world was watching. Her phone buzzed again. Another news outlet requesting a statement. Another journalist wanting an exclusive. Her name, once synonymous with quiet resilience and community advocacy, was now trending across social media. Angela Williams, community leader, tackled and arrested in broad daylight. Officer Michael Reynolds faces suspension after controversial use of force. She was resisting. Police department responds to the viral video. Her fingers hovered over the phone before she silenced the notifications. It's already happening, she murmured. Daniel sat down across from her, his expression grim. What is? The conversation. She exhaled. People are already debating it. Whether I looked suspicious. Whether I moved too quickly. Whether I should have just done more to avoid it. Daniel's hand tightened around hers. You did everything right, Angie. She gave him a tired smile. And yet, I was still on the ground. A moment of silence passed between them. Then Daniel straightened, resolve hardening in his eyes. The press conference is tomorrow. Karen wants you front and center. Angela leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. I know. Are you ready? Angela thought about that for a long time before answering. I don't know if I'll ever be, she admitted, but I won't stay silent. The press conference. A city holds its breath. The next morning, Riverton's City Hall Plaza was packed. Cameras lined the steps, microphones adjusted, journalists murmuring into their earpieces as they prepared their reports. Community members crowded together, some holding up signs, "Justice for Angela," while others simply waited, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and simmering frustration. Karen Brooks stood at the podium, a sharp navy blazer wrapped around her as she gripped the sides of the lectern. Her expression was cool, composed. She had spent the morning fielding calls from city officials, police liaisons, and furious members of the public. She knew how delicate this moment was. Beside her, Angela stood tall, her bruised face uncovered, her gaze level. Mayor Daniel Williams stood to her left, while Detective Lisa Hernandez and other city officials flanked them. The symbolism was clear. The community, the leadership, and law enforcement, at least some of it, stood united. Karen leaned toward the microphone. "We are here today because an injustice occurred," she began. "We are here today because Angela Williams, a beloved community leader, a woman who has dedicated her life to this city, was thrown to the ground, restrained, and arrested without cause." Murmurs spread through the crowd, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "This is not an isolated incident," Karen continued. "This is part of a pattern, a systemic issue that we can no longer ignore. And I will be clear, we will not ignore it." The crowd erupted in applause. Karen stepped back, gesturing for Angela to take the podium. Angela exhaled, stepping forward. Her eyes swept across the sea of faces. Some she recognized, friends, fellow activists, members of the youth center. Others were strangers, but they were here, listening. She took a steady breath. "When I was lying on that pavement," she began, "I wasn't thinking about making history. I wasn't thinking about being a symbol. I was thinking about how many times I've had to tell the kids at the youth center to stay calm, to comply, to do everything right, so that this wouldn't happen to them." Silence. She met the cameras directly, her voice unwavering. "And yet, I did everything right. And still, I was on the ground." A shift moved through the crowd. People held their breath. Angela's voice strengthened. "So I ask, how much more do we have to do? How much more do we have to prove that we belong in our own communities? That we are allowed to walk down the street without being seen as threats?" Shouts of agreement rang out. "I have spent my life working with law enforcement," Angela continued. "I have sat in on panels, pushed for reform, worked to bridge the gap between police and this community. And yet, a single officer with unchecked power still saw me as a suspect first." She turned slightly, addressing both the crowd and the officers behind her. "So I say this to the Riverton Police Department. If you are truly here to protect and serve, then protect us. Serve us. Because we are no longer accepting silence. We are no longer accepting empty promises. We demand accountability." Cheers erupted, rolling through the crowd like thunder. Angela stood firm. "We deserve better, and we will not stop until we get better." The applause was deafening. Angela stepped back, her heart pounding. Karen squeezed her shoulder as she retook the podium. "Officer Reynolds is currently under investigation, and his suspension will remain in place. But that is not enough. We demand full accountability. And we demand change." A reporter raised his hand. "Is Officer Reynolds facing charges?" Karen's jaw tightened. "That is a question for the department and the city prosecutors. But I assure you, we will not let this fade away." Another reporter chimed in. "Mayor Williams, do you believe this incident has damaged the public's trust in law enforcement?" Daniel stepped forward, his expression grave. "Trust is built on action. And right now, the people of Riverton are waiting to see real action. Words aren't enough. And as mayor, I will do everything in my power to ensure that this moment does not pass without meaningful change." The conference ended in a roar of voices, flashing cameras, and renewed energy. Angela turned to Jamal, who had stood in the crowd the entire time, his eyes shining with determination. "Did I do okay?" she asked him quietly. Jamal grinned. "You did more than okay. You made them listen." Angela nodded, exhaling. But even as she stepped away from the podium, she knew this was far from over. This was just the beginning of the fight. The battle for justice begins. The press conference had sent shockwaves through Riverton, rippling beyond the city limits and igniting conversations across the country. Angela Williams' words had become headlines, soundbites, and rallying cries. Social media was flooded with clips of her speech, and hashtags like #JusticeForAngela and #accountability now were trending. But as the cameras packed up and the crowds dispersed, Angela knew the hardest part was still ahead. Words had power, but they alone wouldn't change a system built on injustice. Real change required more than speeches. It required action. And action meant making powerful people uncomfortable. The internal war within the police department. Across town, in the headquarters of the Riverton Police Department, a very different kind of meeting was taking place. Chief Gerald Monroe sat at the head of the long conference table, his gray hair neatly combed, his uniform crisp. He had been with the department for nearly 30 years, and he had seen his fair share of public scandals. This, however, was different. "This situation is escalating," Monroe said, his voice tight, "and not in our favor." Seated around the table were several senior officers, including Captain Renee Dawson, head of Internal Affairs, and Lieutenant Mark Callahan, a longtime ally of Reynolds. "This is ridiculous," Callahan scoffed, leaning back in his chair. Reynolds was just doing his job. Dawson folded her arms. "If that's how you see it, maybe you should be under investigation too." Callahan shot her a glare. "Come on. We're seriously going to hang one of our own out to dry over this." The woman resisted. "The video shows otherwise," Dawson countered. "The entire country is watching. If we don't handle this right, we lose all credibility." Monroe rubbed his temple. "Reynolds has already been placed on administrative leave. The mayor is calling for further action. We need a plan." Callahan scoffed. "A plan? You mean a scapegoat? We all know how this works. They want a name to blame so the public calms down." Dawson narrowed her eyes. "The public wants justice." Callahan let out a bitter laugh. "Justice, or a sacrifice?" Monroe cut through the tension with a sharp wave of his hand. "Enough. Internal Affairs will continue their investigation. But we need to be clear. This isn't just about Reynolds. This department is under scrutiny now. Any officer who thinks they can act recklessly is putting us all in the line of fire." Callahan muttered something under his breath but fell silent. Dawson sat forward. "What about Angela Williams? Has anyone reached out to her?" Monroe shook his head. "We need to tread carefully. The last thing we want is another public incident." Dawson tapped a pen against the table. "Avoiding her isn't the answer. If we don't acknowledge what happened, we risk making her the face of a movement we can't control." Monroe sighed. "She already is the face of the movement." A heavy silence filled the room. Because they all knew this wasn't going away. And Reynolds wasn't the only one about to feel the consequences. Angela's next move. Back at her home, Angela sat in her living room, surrounded by stacks of legal documents, community petitions, and news reports. Her phone had not stopped ringing all morning. Calls from reporters, activists, and even politicians who suddenly wanted to align themselves with her. Karen Brooks sat across from her, scrolling through her tablet. "The city council is planning an emergency session to discuss the case." Angela raised an eyebrow. "Which means they're panicking." Karen smirked. "Of course. They don't want this becoming a lawsuit." Angela exhaled, leaning back. "But it will become one." Karen glanced up. "You're sure about that?" Angela nodded. "This isn't just about Reynolds. It's about an entire system that allows officers like him to act with impunity. If we don't push now, they'll just wait for the outrage to die down." Karen set her tablet aside. "I won't pretend this will be easy. The police union is already pushing back. They're claiming Reynolds acted within protocol." Angela let out a humorless laugh. "And what protocol is that? Assault first, ask questions later." Karen sighed. "We need legal backing. If we're going to force real change, we need someone who knows how to fight this in court." Angela pulled out a card from her desk and slid it across the table. Karen picked it up, reading the name. Her eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Thomas Graham, the civil rights attorney." Angela nodded. "He reached out this morning." Karen gave a low whistle. If he's willing to take the case, this could get serious. He's taken down entire police departments before. Angela's expression hardened. Good, because I'm not stopping until they have no choice but to change. The police union strikes back. The next morning, a statement from the Riverton Police Union hit the news. It read, "Officer Michael Reynolds has been unfairly vilified in the court of public opinion. His actions were in line with his training, and any disciplinary measures taken against him set a dangerous precedent for officers attempting to do their jobs. The Riverton Police Union stands firmly behind Officer Reynolds and will challenge any attempts to wrongfully terminate or prosecute him." Angela read the statement in silence before setting the newspaper down. She had expected this. It was textbook police union strategy. Frame the officer as the victim, shift the blame, make it seem like accountability was a threat to policing itself. Karen sat across from her, scrolling through responses online. The backlash is already growing. People are furious. Angela took a sip of coffee. Good. Let them be. Karen glanced at her. So, what's next? Angela leaned forward. We push harder. A new front in the fight. That afternoon, Angela and a group of community leaders marched into City Hall. They were there for one reason: to demand the immediate termination and indictment of Officer Reynolds. The mayor's office was overwhelmed, the lobby packed with reporters and activists. Angela was not alone. She was backed by Riverton's most prominent pastors, educators, and business owners. They had petitions. They had legal demands. And most of all, they had momentum. Inside the mayor's office, Daniel Williams was already deep in tense discussions with city attorneys and law enforcement representatives. The city was under immense pressure, and they were running out of ways to stall. Angela was done waiting. She strode through the doors, her presence commanding. "We need to talk," she said firmly. Daniel looked up, meeting her gaze. And in that moment, he knew this was no longer just a political crisis. This was a revolution. The breaking point. Outside City Hall, crowds gathered, holding signs, chanting, demanding action. And then the news broke. Officer Michael Reynolds had left the state. He had quietly resigned from the Riverton Police Department and fled town just days before potential charges were to be filed. The fury that followed was unlike anything the city had seen before. Angela stood in the heart of it, feeling the anger, the betrayal. But she was not surprised. Because she knew one thing. The fight wasn't just about one officer. It was about all of them. And it was far from over. Angela Williams stood on the steps of City Hall, looking out over the mass of people that had gathered below. The midday sun burned hot overhead, but the heat in the crowd came from something deeper. An anger that had been simmering for too long and was now ready to boil over. The chants of "no justice, no peace" echoed off the surrounding buildings, reverberating through the city. Karen Brooks stood at her side, her phone buzzing nonstop with updates from inside the mayor's office. "They're in full panic mode," she murmured. They didn't expect Reynolds to flee. Angela clenched her fists. She had seen the news report just moments ago. Officer Michael Reynolds had quietly resigned from the Riverton Police Department and left the state before any formal charges could be filed against him. His departure was a slap in the face, a clear attempt to escape accountability. Her voice was steady, but inside, her fury raged. "We need to make it clear. This isn't over." Karen nodded. "Then let's go in there and make sure they understand that." Together, they turned and marched up the marble steps into City Hall, pushing through the crowd of reporters waiting just beyond the barricades. The doors swung open, and they stepped into the chaos of the mayor's office. Inside, the tension was thick. City officials were engaged in frantic discussions, voices overlapping in a tangled mess of excuses and half-baked solutions. Mayor Daniel Williams, Angela's husband, stood near his desk, his expression tight as he spoke with Riverton's district attorney and Chief Monroe of the Riverton Police Department. The moment he saw Angela and Karen enter, he straightened. Angela wasted no time. How did Reynolds manage to leave the state? Monroe exhaled through his nose. He resigned. There was no legal reason to hold him. No legal reason, Angela repeated, incredulous. He tackled an unarmed woman, used excessive force, and falsely accused me of theft. That's on camera. What more do you need? The district attorney, a wiry man named Tom Garrison, adjusted his tie uncomfortably. Technically, an investigation was still ongoing. Without formal charges, we had no grounds to detain him. Karen scoffed. So you dragged your feet just long enough for him to disappear. We followed protocol, Monroe snapped. Angela stepped closer, her voice calm but firm. Then changed the protocol. Silence fell over the room. Angela let the weight of her words settle before continuing. Because let me be clear, this isn't going away. The people outside. She gestured toward the windows, where the roar of protesters could still be heard. They are not going to forget. You let one officer slip away, but we will not let this department, or this city, avoid responsibility. Monroe rubbed his temple. What exactly are you asking for, Angela? I want Reynolds extradited and charged, and I want an independent investigation into the entire department. Monroe shook his head. That's not how this works. Angela's jaw tightened. Then we'll make it work. Karen stepped forward. We're prepared to file a civil lawsuit against the Riverton Police Department. The community is backing it, and we've already been in talks with the ACLU and multiple civil rights groups. If the city refuses to act, we'll take this as far as we need to. The mayor sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. Angela, you know how complicated this is. Angela's eyes flashed. What's complicated is the fact that I was assaulted and humiliated on the street in broad daylight for nothing. What's complicated is the fact that my attacker is now a free man, while the city debates whether or not my dignity is worth protecting. She turned to Monroe. You're the chief of police. Do you stand by what Reynolds did? Monroe hesitated. The weight of the question pressed down on him. Angela took a step closer. Answer me. Finally, Monroe exhaled and said, No, I don't. The admission was small, but it was something. Angela pressed on. Then say it publicly. Acknowledge that what happened was wrong. Show the people outside that their trust in law enforcement isn't completely misplaced. The room was silent again. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Monroe nodded. I'll issue a statement. Angela wasn't satisfied. And the mayor glanced at Monroe before looking at the district attorney. Garrison sighed. We'll formally open an independent review into the police department. Angela's eyes stayed locked on him. And Karen smirked. She knew Angela wasn't letting this go until they got something real. Finally, Monroe relented. I'll push for immediate suspension of any officer currently under investigation for excessive force. Angela nodded slowly. Then do it. Today. Monroe gave a short nod. It'll be done. Angela took a deep breath. It wasn't enough, not by a long shot, but it was a start. A movement ignites. By the time Angela and Karen exited City Hall, the press was already waiting. Microphones were thrust in their faces, cameras flashing, voices shouting over one another. Angela stepped up to the makeshift podium that had been set up outside. She could see the crowd still gathered, waiting for answers. She took the microphone and looked out over the people who had stood with her through all of this. We are not done fighting, she declared. The crowd roared in response. The Riverton Police Department has agreed to an independent review. They have agreed to suspend officers under investigation for excessive force. These are small steps, but they are steps forward. More cheers. Angela raised her voice. But we will demand more. We will demand accountability, not just for Officer Reynolds, but for every officer who has abused their power. We will demand reform, not just in Riverton, but everywhere that injustice exists. The energy in the crowd surged. This is just the beginning, she said, because we are done being silent. The cheers that followed weren't just noise. They were power. Angela stepped back, her heart pounding. She met Jamal's eyes in the crowd, saw the fire in them, the same fire she had carried for so many years. And she knew this fight wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to all of them. And they weren't going anywhere. The reckoning. The pressure on Riverton's city leadership had reached a boiling point. The protests, the national media attention, and the unrelenting voices of community leaders had forced movement. But Angela Williams knew that movement didn't necessarily mean justice. She sat in a conference room with her legal team, civil rights attorney Thomas Graham leading the discussion. The air was thick with urgency. "The lawsuit is gaining traction," Graham said, adjusting his glasses as he skimmed through a thick stack of legal documents. "We have enough evidence to proceed with a civil rights violation case against both Officer Reynolds and the Riverton Police Department as a whole." Angela leaned forward, rubbing her hands together. "And what about criminal charges?" Graham sighed, flipping to another page. "That's the tricky part. The district attorney's office is hesitant to charge Reynolds. With him out of state, extradition would require more political will than they're currently willing to muster." Angela's frustration simmered beneath the surface. "So they're just going to let him walk?" Karen Brooks, sitting beside her, spoke up. "Not if we keep the pressure on." Angela nodded. "Then we don't let them breathe." Graham smirked. "That's what I like to hear. The union pushes back." But just as Angela and her allies pushed forward, the police union mounted its counterattack. The morning after their legal team filed the lawsuit, the Riverton Police Union held a press conference of its own. Standing at the podium was Union President Robert Kessler, a thick-jawed man with decades of experience defending police officers, no matter how damning the evidence. "This has been a blatant attack on the hardworking men and women of the Riverton Police Department," Kessler declared. "Officer Reynolds acted in accordance with his training and in response to a perceived threat. He has been vilified in the media, and now an entire department is being targeted because of political pressure." Angela watched the broadcast from her office at the youth center, her jaw clenching at Kessler's words. "This is their strategy," Karen said beside her. "They frame Reynolds as the victim. They make it about protecting officers rather than accountability." Angela exhaled sharply. "And that's exactly why we can't let up." Kessler continued. "The department has already suffered enough. We are demanding that all disciplinary actions against officers involved in this incident be dropped immediately. Furthermore, we will be filing a counter-lawsuit against Angela Williams for defamation." Angela's blood ran cold. "They're coming after me," she murmured. Karen scoffed. "Let them try." A national uprising. Angela's case had become bigger than Riverton. Across the country, activists, celebrities, and civil rights leaders were speaking out in support. The viral footage of her arrest had sparked renewed conversations about police brutality, and major networks were broadcasting nightly segments on the case. One of the biggest moments came when a nationally recognized civil rights leader, Reverend Elijah Tate, arrived in Riverton to march in solidarity. Angela met him outside the church where a community rally was being held. "You've done something incredible here," Tate said, his deep voice carrying the weight of decades of activism. Angela shook her head. "I don't want to be a symbol. I just want justice." Tate smiled knowingly. "Justice comes at a price, my dear. And whether you like it or not, you've become the face of something much bigger." Inside the church, hundreds gathered. Angela took the stage, looking out at the faces, young, old, black, brown, white, all standing together for the same cause. "We are not asking for justice," she said into the microphone. "We are demanding it." The crowd erupted in cheers. City Hall's breaking point. Behind the scenes, Riverton's leaders were cracking under pressure. Mayor Daniel Williams sat in his office with a team of advisors, the tension in the room palpable. "We can't afford another week of protests like this," an aide said. "The city's reputation is on the line." Daniel looked at the police chief. "If we don't move forward with charges against Reynolds, we'll be sending the message that officers can act without consequences. Monroe shifted in his seat. The union is putting pressure on us not to act. Daniel's eyes darkened. And the people are putting pressure on us to act. Silence. Finally, Monroe sighed. I'll recommend to the district attorney that charges be filed. Daniel nodded. Do it. Justice, finally in sight. The next morning, Angela woke to a flurry of news notifications. Breaking. City of Riverton moves forward with criminal charges against former officer Michael Reynolds. Angela sat up in bed, scanning the articles. Reynolds would face charges of excessive force, false arrest, and misconduct in public office. Her phone rang. It was Karen. Did you see? Karen asked, breathless. I saw. They caved. They finally caved. Angela let out a slow breath, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on her. It's not over, she said, but it's a step. Karen's voice softened. And you made it happen. Angela closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself feel the moment. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time, real justice felt possible, and she would see it through to the end. The verdict that shook a nation. Angela Williams sat in the courtroom, her hands clasped together in her lap, her breath steady but deep. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that suffocates even the most composed individuals. Around her, the seats were filled, reporters scribbling notes, activists waiting with bated breath, city officials whispering amongst themselves. The entire nation had its eyes on this trial. At the defendant's table sat Michael Reynolds, his once confident posture now rigid with unease. The former officer had been brought back to Riverton after an extradition battle that the police union had fought tooth and nail to prevent. But the weight of public scrutiny had been too much, and in the end, not even his department's backing had been able to shield him. His lawyer, a sharp-suited man named James Felton, adjusted his tie and whispered something to him. Reynolds didn't respond. He simply stared ahead, his jaw clenched, his expression unreadable. Across the aisle, Angela sat with her legal team, Thomas Graham leading the charge. Her husband, Mayor Daniel Williams, sat beside her, his presence steadying. Karen Brooks, who had been by her side since the beginning, squeezed her hand. You ready for this? Karen whispered. Angela nodded. I have to be. The judge entered, the courtroom rising in unison before settling back down. Judge Margaret Hollis was a formidable woman. Fair, but not one to tolerate nonsense. She adjusted her glasses and turned her gaze toward the jury. Has the jury reached a verdict? She asked. A young black woman in the jury box stood. The foreperson. She gripped the edge of the podium and took a deep breath. Yes, Your Honor, we have. Angela held her breath. In the case of State of Riverton versus Michael Reynolds, on the charge of excessive force, we find the defendant. The world around Angela slowed. The reporters' pens hovered over their notepads. The room seemed frozen in time. Even Reynolds, for all his bravado, had his fingers curled tightly against the table, his knuckles pale. Guilty. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some sighed in relief, others tensed for what would come next. Judge Hollis remained impassive, and on the charge of false arrest, the foreperson's voice didn't waver. Guilty. This time, Angela's breath hitched. It was happening. It was really happening. The judge nodded. The court accepts the jury's findings. Sentencing will be determined at a later date. She turned toward Reynolds. Mr. Reynolds, you have been found guilty on multiple charges. You are hereby remanded into custody until sentencing. It took a moment for Reynolds to register what had just been said. His lawyer immediately stood. Your Honor, we request bail pending sentencing. Denied. Judge Hollis said firmly. The gavel slammed. And just like that, the man who had pressed Angela's face into the pavement was led away in handcuffs. The room erupted into a mixture of cheers and outrage. The police union representatives in the back scowled, some storming out. Reynolds' lawyer looked furious, already preparing an appeal. But none of that mattered at that moment. Angela let out a shaky breath. Karen grinned. You did it. But Angela shook her head. We did it. The aftermath. A city transformed. The days following the verdict were unlike anything Riverton had seen before. The tension that had gripped the city for weeks had transformed into something different, something resembling hope. Crowds flooded the streets, celebrating, chanting, holding up signs that read, "Justice for Angela. Police reform now. We are not done." At the youth center, Angela sat in her office, watching the news coverage. The verdict had not only sparked discussions in Riverton, it had ignited a national debate on police accountability. Cities across the country were now re-examining their own cases of excessive force, protests reigniting with renewed purpose. The police union, in a desperate attempt to regain control, issued a statement decrying the verdict. "This sets a dangerous precedent," Kessler had said in a press conference. "Good officers will now hesitate to do their jobs, fearing unfair persecution." Angela had heard that argument before, and she was tired of it. She picked up her phone and dialed Karen. "We need to keep pushing." Karen chuckled on the other end. "I had a feeling you'd say that. What's the next move?" Angela leaned back, watching footage of people marching, holding up her name like a battle cry. "We've won one fight," she said. "Now we fight for real reform." Riverton's new future. 2 months later, the Riverton Police Accountability Act passed in City Hall. The bill, spearheaded by community leaders, including Angela, introduced sweeping reforms: mandatory body cameras for all officers, an independent review board to investigate police misconduct, stronger penalties for excessive force, a requirement that all officers undergo racial bias and de-escalation training. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. On the day of its signing, Angela stood beside Mayor Daniel Williams as he took the podium. "This city has been tested," he said, looking out over the sea of faces, "and we have shown that change is possible. But let me be clear, this is just the beginning." Angela stepped up next. She looked over the crowd, seeing Jamal standing near the front. His face was bright, full of hope, no longer weighed down by fear. Her voice was steady, unwavering. "We have fought for justice, but now we must fight to make sure no one else has to go through what I did. We are here to say that this system can change, and we are not stopping until it does." The crowd roared. Angela turned to Karen. "We keep going." Karen smiled. "Damn right we do." As the crowd cheered, as history was made, Angela knew. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning.